Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Please like and subscribe so I can tell more interesting stories. Now, let's get started. The wilderness does not whisper. It growls, it creaks, it howls in the night like it's got something to prove, and you better believe I heard every last bit of it. My name is Hugh Glass, and in the spring of 1823, I signed on with the Ashley Henry expedition. We were a group of fur trappers heading deep into the uncharted American frontier, right up along the Missouri River, hunting for beaver pelts, and the kind of fortune that always seems shinier from a distance. Now, you'd think a man with a name like Ashley might sound soft, but General William Ashley was about as hard-edged as the Rockies themselves. He wanted men who could carry a 100-pound pack, shoot straight, and not flinch when a bullet buzzed past their ear. Naturally, I signed up. Let me be honest. I wasn't looking for glory or brotherhood. I was running. From what? Well, maybe from my past as a pirate with Jean Lafitte, or the time I got captured by the Pawnee and lived with them for several years. Historians still debate whether I truly embraced their way of life or was just playing along to survive. Either way, I carried their marks on my body and in my memory. I had reasons for heading west that didn't fit neatly on a recruitment form. We pushed through thick brush-crossed icy rivers and hiked under stars so bright you'd think someone lit the sky on fire just for us. Nights were bone cold and mornings colder. One guy, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste, claimed the spirits of the woods were watching us. He'd spit twice over his shoulder before every river crossing. It didn't help with the chill, but it sure entertained the rest of us. We were heading into the land of the Arikara, a tribe not too pleased with white men tromping through their territory with rifles and traps. Ashley knew that. We all knew it. But beaver pelts fetched top dollar and danger was just part of the job description. Every man had a rifle, a knife, and a vague idea of what they were doing. You either survived by your wits or died with a really good excuse. One night, sitting around the fire, I remember hearing Fitzgerald boasting about how he could gut a bear with a fork if needed. I chuckled into my stew. Fitzgerald was the kind of man who'd lie about the time just to hear himself talk. Good shot, though. Sharp eyes. Not someone you'd want behind your back for too long. I didn't trust many folks in that camp. Maybe Bridger young kid, maybe 17. He had the kind of earnest face you wanted to protect, but not the kind of backbone you'd bet your life on. Still, he was learning. The land changed as we moved north. Trees got denser, the air damper. Everything smelled of moss and old water. One morning I volunteered to scout ahead. It was quiet. Too quiet. You know how people say that right before a horror movie, jump scare. Well, in the woods, quiet is louder than thunder. I was maybe a mile from camp when I heard a rustle, low, deliberate. I crouched, rifle ready. Thought it might be elk. Maybe a wolf. What it was worse. That's when I saw her, a massive grizzly sow, maybe 600 pounds, her fur streaked with mud and blood, standing between me and her cubs. You've heard the phrase, caught between a rock and a hard place. Forget the rock. The bear is the place. Here's a bizarre fact to distract you. Grizzly bears can run up to 35 miles per hour. That's faster than a racehorse over short distances. I didn't get a chance to appreciate the biology. She came at me like a cannonball made of teeth and rage. I fired my rifle, but unless you hit them dead between the eyes, it just makes them madder. She was on me in seconds. I tried to stab her with my knife, but her paw swatted me like a rag doll. My world became claws, fur pain, and the smell of rotting meat and pine. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the sound, the cracking of my own ribs, the wet tear of muscle, the growl so deep It rattled my spine. People romanticize the wilderness. Let me tell you, it's not poetry. It's a punchline with claws. I don't remember passing out, but when I came to, I was still breathing. Barely. My back was shredded. One leg shattered, my throat torn open, so I could barely speak. I could hear voices. Bridger and Fitzgerald had found me. I thought they'd help me back to camp. When I woke up again, I couldn't move much, just enough to feel the mud under me and the wind cutting through my shredded clothes. My vision swam. My throat gurgled when I tried to speak, and every breath was like dragging barbed wire through my lungs. Fitzgerald stood over me, hands on his hips, looking more irritated than worried. "Still breathing," he muttered. "That's a shame. Nice guy, right?" Bridger crouched beside me. The kid looked sick. His face had gone ghost white, like he was seeing something out of a nightmare. I guess I was that nightmare. I didn't look like a man anymore. I looked like meat that had been in a bar fight. They dragged me back to camp on a makeshift litter, every jolt lighting fireworks across my back. The other men took one look and knew I wasn't walking out of that forest. General Ashley, to his credit, wanted to wait with me, but the Arikara were closing in, and we couldn't afford a standoff. The decision was made 2 volunteers would stay with me until I either died or, well, yeah, mostly just until I died. Fitzgerald and Bridger stepped forward. One was paid. The other felt guilty. I'll let you guess which was which. Historical fact, in those days, standard compensation for guarding the dying was about $80. That's a lot of money for a couple of weeks of sitting still. Or, as Fitzgerald saw it, for digging a shallow grave and making sure the guy inside didn't crawl out. For a few days, they fed me broth, kept the flies off me, and mumbled about how much longer it'd take. I couldn't speak, but I heard everything. Every complaint, every whisper. Every time Fitzgerald poked at my gear, trying to figure out what was worth stealing. Then one morning, I opened my eyes and saw Bridger holding my rifle. He was crying, not sobbing, just silent tears running down his face as he handed it to Fitzgerald. "He's not going to make it," Fitzgerald said. "No sense letting that fine rifle rot with him." I wanted to scream. Instead, I blinked once, just once, but it was enough. Bridger looked at me. He saw it, saw that I was still there, still fighting. But Fitzgerald didn't care. They took my rifle, my knife, even my powder horn, everything I'd need to survive. Then they dug a shallow hole, rolled me near it, and left. That's not metaphor. That's exactly what they did. Dumped me half dead in a ditch like an overcooked turkey and walked off, leaving my fate to the flies, the wolves, and whatever other horrors roamed those woods. Historians still debate whether Bridger truly wanted to leave or if Fitzgerald forced his hand. Some say the kid was too scared to stand up to him. Others think he was just trying to stay alive himself. I don't blame him. Much. Anyway, lying there in that muddy grave, unable to speak, barely able to breathe, I didn't have some big Hollywood moment, no dramatic vow of revenge, no swelling music, just pain and cold and a buzzing in my ears that I thought was death itself. Then I felt a beetle crawl into my open wound. Yep, that's your bizarre fact for the day. Beetles love moist environments, and apparently bare-clawed backs count. And that was it. The turning point. Because if bugs were interested, I figured vultures wouldn't be far behind. I wasn't ready to be picked apart. Now, I know what you're thinking. How do you even start to move when your leg's broken, your back's shredded, and you've got no food or weapons? The answer is badly. Very, very badly. But I had something stronger than weapons, or stew, or even prayer. I had spite. Pure, undiluted, soul-burning spite. I wasn't crawling toward safety. I was crawling toward them. toward Fitzgerald, toward that stolen rifle, toward the men who wrote me off like I was nothing. Every inch was agony. My body felt like it was stitched together with thorns. I couldn't stand. I couldn't shout. All I had were elbows and willpower. I dragged myself across the forest floor like a wounded animal, leaving a trail of blood, mud, and anger behind me. Funny side note, raccoons followed me for 2 days. Guess I was their traveling buffet. I had to snarl at them to keep them from nibbling. Imagine that. Can't walk, can't talk, but still intimidating enough to scare off raccoons. Take the wins where you can. No one tells you how loud the forest is when you're alone in it. Every crack of a twig sounded like a rifle. Every whisper of wind could be a predator's breath. But I didn't stop. Not for sleep, not for pain, not for anything. I knew there was an outpost south of me, Fort Kiowa. It was more than 100 miles away. 100 miles. Through enemy territory. With no food, no weapon, and nothing but vengeance crawling through my veins like fire ants. You think you've had a bad day? Try that on for size. I won't lie. The first few days of crawling were the worst. And by few, I mean I lost track somewhere between the second squirrel carcass and the time I tried to eat moss off a rock. When you're lying belly down in the underbrush with half your back peeled open like a bad joke, you start to think about time differently. A minute can last a mile. A mile can last a week. And every second you wonder if something out there's watching you, just to see how long it takes before you give up. But I didn't. That's the thing no one tells you about survival. It's not a battle. It's a negotiation. Every day I had to ask myself, do I want to die here? Right here, next to this particularly judgmental-looking tree root. And every time I'd mutter, well, think not yet, I started to figure out the rhythm of the land. I'd crawl before dawn rest during the day, move again by moonlight. I wrapped my wounds in bark strips and mud. Yeah, it stung like the devil, but it kept the maggots out, which was a luxury at that point. Historical fact. Back then, mountain men actually welcomed maggots in wounds because they ate the dead flesh. Weird, right? But not me. I wasn't going to let anything eat me unless it was after I was already dead. And even then, I'd prefer something with manners. Water was the trick. I couldn't risk going too far from streams. Luckily, the Grand River wasn't far, and I began crawling parallel to it. I drank straight from it, face first, like a dog. It wasn't classy, but who was I impressing a beaver? And yes, I ate a beaver. Raw. Don't ask how I caught it. Just know that rage is an excellent motivator. I also ate roots bugs and what I think was some kind of mushroom. Might have hallucinated for half a day, not sure. I had a long conversation with a log named Harold. Here's your bizarre fact. Porcupines were once considered a delicacy by French trappers. I, however, can confirm they are not delicious raw. Spiky little nightmares. But desperate is as desperate does. Somewhere around day 10, give or take, since I didn't exactly have a pocket watch, I started dragging myself into open plains. That's when things got dangerous. See, the forest hides you, but out there. On the plains, I was a buffet on a silver platter. I kept low-crawled at night and covered myself in mud to mask the smell. A couple of wolves tailed me for miles, sniffing around like I was some half-baked venison. I scared them off by yelling, which, by the way, was the first sound I'd managed since the attack. It came out more like a dying moose, but it worked. And then came the real game changer, the river. Floating was my salvation. I found a downed cottonwood tree, old half-hollowed by time, and managed to roll it into the water. I wedged myself inside and let the current carry me. Not glamorous, not comfortable, but better than dragging myself over rocks until my elbows looked like leather. Historians still debate whether I floated for a week or just a few days. But however long it was, I passed through the territory I had no business being in. Arikara country. They'd attacked the expedition weeks earlier and were still looking for payback. I knew if they found me, they'd finish what the bear started and probably skin me for good measure. So I drifted, stayed quiet, hid during daylight in the hollow of my floating log, only moving under cover of dusk. Once I heard voices from the riverbank, Arikara hunters, maybe 10 feet away. My heart beat so hard, I thought it'd echo across the water. Here's something odd you might not know. The sound of river water trickling over rocks can hide human voices better than you'd expect. Nature's own stealth system. I kept drifting, biting my tongue every time I hit a sandbar or got jabbed by a branch. Couldn't make a fire. Couldn't fish properly. I was growing thinner by the day, my skin peeling from exposure, my bones aching like they'd been hollowed out and refilled with ice. But I had one thing direction. I knew Fort Kiowa lay further downriver, past the Arikara line, past the nightmares, past everything trying to kill me. Some nights, I'd dream of food. Not stew or venison, no. I dreamed about biscuits. Fresh, flaky biscuits. The kind with real butter that melted into the cracks. I'd wake up chewing air mouthful of leaves, furious and starving. Still I floated. Still I crawled. I remember one night I looked up and saw the northern lights flickering in the sky. That's not poetic fluff. I actually did. Sheets of green and red dancing over me like the sky was celebrating my misery. And for a second I laughed, out loud. Ragged, rusty laughter. The stars blinked back unimpressed. When I finally crawled out of the river and onto the final stretch of land leading to Fort Kiowa, my body was nearly unrecognizable. My wounds had crusted over my beard, was tangled with leaves, and I smelled like something that had died, come back to life, and then died again. But I could see the smoke from chimneys in the distance. Civilization, salvation, or at least a warm place to collapse. When I finally staggered into Fort Kiowa, it was like walking into a dream, or more accurately, like crawling into one, because walking was still far beyond my abilities at the time. The fort was a small outpost, mostly wood and mud and smoke, perched near the confluence of the Missouri and the White Rivers. Traders passed through, mostly French and American, some native allies, some not so allied. It wasn't exactly a bustling city, but compared to where I'd been, it might as well have been Paris. I collapsed right at the gates, couldn't speak, could barely move, but someone saw me, probably a kid, based on the yelling that followed. Ghost. I heard someone shout, "It's a ghost." That's when I blacked out. Again. When I came to, I was wrapped in furs, bandaged, fed some sort of broth that tasted like dirt and dreams, and surrounded by faces that didn't know whether to be afraid or amazed. One of the traders leaned over me and asked, "Are you Hugh Glass?" I nodded. That's all I could manage. You've heard the phrase, living legend, right? Well, apparently, I'd skipped living and gone straight to legend. News of my death had beaten me to the fort by weeks. Most of them had already told stories about the bear attack, the funeral, and the 2 brave men who stayed behind to bury me. Imagine their faces when the man from the grave showed up looking like a half-boiled scarecrow. Historical fact. Fort Kiowa was one of the most important trade hubs for fur trappers along the Missouri, and it operated as a relay station for frontier news, aka gossip with a compass. So yeah, word had traveled fast. It didn't take long before I was sitting upright, eating real food, and more importantly, talking again. My voice sounded like sandpaper, dragged across a banjo, but I didn't care. "Where's Fitzgerald?" I croaked. The room went quiet, Someone said, "Gone east, joined the army." Of course he did. Now, here's your bizarre fact of the day. At the time, army enlistment was one of the easiest ways to disappear from trouble. If you joined up, the army pretty much wiped the slate clean. Debts gone. Enemies protected by uniform. Morals optional. Bridger, though, he was still nearby. The boy had returned to trapping with a group just a few days' ride upriver. I had a choice to make: hunt down the young man who left me for dead, or go after the real thief, Fitzgerald, the one who'd taken my gear, my rifle, and my dignity. Guess which one I picked? Yeah, I went after Bridger first. Now, before you call me heartless, hear me out. I needed answers. I needed to look that kid in the eye and ask if he knew I was still alive when he walked away. I needed to see if there was regret or just fear. When I found him, he didn't even try to run. Just stood there, face pale, jaw shaking like a leaf in a storm. He looked like someone who'd been seeing ghosts in his sleep. And now the ghost had shown up wearing buckskins and rage. I stared him down for what felt like an hour. Then I asked, "Did you think I was dead?" He nodded too fast. Fitzgerald said, "He said you were gone, that you weren't breathing. I didn't know, Mr. Glass, I swear." Historians still debate whether Bridger truly believed I was dead or whether he simply let himself believe it because it was easier. I don't know, maybe both. But in that moment, I saw something in his eyes, guilt, yes, but also relief, like he'd been waiting for the reckoning and was oddly grateful it had finally come. I let him go, told him to keep his head down, stay out of trouble, and never leave another man behind. He nodded like his life depended on it, which it very nearly did. With Bridger off the list, I turned my attention back to Fitzgerald. He'd joined the army, was stationed at a post somewhere further east. That meant if I wanted to find him, I'd need to travel again. And not just travel, I'd need to walk, ride swim, and crawl across more hostile land to get to him. And you better believe I was going to do it. There's something weird about revenge. People think it feels like fire, like a blaze inside your chest that drives you forward. But for me, it felt cold, icy, calculated. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't yelling. I was just moving. Every step I took was measured every day. A quiet chant. He took my rifle. He left me for dead. I started to rebuild, found a horse, packed supplies, took my time. I wasn't dragging myself anymore. I was standing, walking, healing. And every night I sat by the fire and stared into it like it owed me something. One trader joked, "You look like you're going to war." I replied, "No, I'm finishing one." Now, I'd crawled 100 miles half dead through the wilderness, survived on bug's bark and raw beaver meat, and narrowly escaped death more times than I could count. But tracking down Fitzgerald, that felt personal. I left Fort Kiowa with a horse, a rifle, a knife, and one goal: to find the man who robbed me, left me to rot, and walked off like I was just another casualty of the wild. He wasn't going to get away with it. Not while I was still breathing. I traveled east along the Missouri River. The land was still dangerous, scattered with Arikara patrols, wild animals, and winter creeping up behind every cold breeze. But by now, I was tougher than the land itself, or maybe just too stubborn to care. Along the way, I stopped at trading posts, asking questions in that same hoarse voice people said sounded like a shovel scraping stone. "Seen a man named Fitzgerald?" I'd ask. "Big mouth, cold eyes, knows how to run when things get hard." Most of the trappers had heard of him. Turns out he hadn't exactly made friends. One guy described him as the kind of man who'd steal your boots while you were drowning just so he could sell them. Historical fact, during the early 1800s, army recruiting posts were scattered across the frontier, And once you signed up, you were government property. Fitzgerald had joined up and been posted to Fort Atkinson, a well-guarded army fort further downriver. Great. A man under the protection of the United States government. Just what I needed. Now, here's a bizarre detail for you. Fort Atkinson had a reputation for being haunted. Soldiers there often claimed to hear phantom footsteps at night, doors opening and closing whispers that had no source. Me. I figured if there were ghosts hanging around, they'd understand why I came. I reached the fort after weeks of travel. I was leaner, meaner, and dressed in animal skins that made me look more myth than man. When I showed up at the gate, the guards eyed me like I was some half-wild thing that had wandered out of the forest with a grudge, and they weren't entirely wrong. I asked to see Fitzgerald. No civilians allowed inside the fort, the sentry told me. Orders. I smiled, well, more like bared my teeth, and said I ain't here for tea. I'm here for a thief. That got me nowhere. So I did the smart thing. I waited, camped outside the fort. Didn't eat much. Didn't sleep much either. Just watched. Every day men came and went. Soldiers laughed, drank, trained. And finally, on the third morning, I saw him. Fitzgerald. He hadn't changed much. Still carried himself like a man who thought the world owed him. Still had that swagger. But this time, I was the one watching him from the shadows. I approached the fort commander that afternoon, asked for a meeting. When he finally let me in, I laid it all out how Fitzgerald had taken my gear, my rifle, my hope. How he'd abandoned a fellow trapper to die in the woods after a bear attack. The commander listened, nodded, then said, "Unfortunately, he's a soldier now. Government man. If you harm him, you could be hanged. Hanged for chasing justice." Historians still debate whether the commander believed my story or just didn't want to deal with the paperwork. Either way, my blood boiled. I had come all this way, carried this fury for months, and now I was being told to let it go. I left the commander's quarters with fire in my chest and ice in my stomach. That night, I considered sneaking in and confronting Fitzgerald myself. Maybe drag him out, rifle to his back, demand my honor back. But what would that prove? That I was just like him? No. That wasn't justice, that was revenge. And I realized something: I didn't need to kill Fitzgerald to win. I just needed him to know. So I waited until morning. Then I found him on the edge of camp alone, tossing pebbles into the river, like a man with no worries in the world. I stepped out from behind a tree, slow and steady, my shadow falling over him like winter. He turned and froze. "Hugh," he said, voice cracking. I didn't smile, didn't yell, just stared, long and hard. I could see it happening, his mouth moving, his skin going pale, his eyes darting like a rabbit cornered by a wolf. "You left me," I said quietly. "You took my rifle, my knife, my life." He stammered something I didn't care. I stepped closer, looked him in the eye. "I should kill you," I whispered, "but I already survived you." That hit harder than any punch. I turned and walked away. You know what he yelled after me? "Sorry." That was it. One weak, miserable word shouted into the back of a man who'd crawled through hell and come out colder, quieter, and somehow still whole. After that final moment with Fitzgerald, I thought I'd feel something big: relief, rage, maybe even closure. But truth be told, I mostly felt tired. Bone-deep tired. Like I'd been carrying a mountain for months and suddenly realized it was made of smoke. I'd tracked the man down, stared him in the eye, and left him with his guilt. And maybe that was better than a bullet. A wound heals, but shame that lingers. I rode away from Fort Atkinson with no real plan. My body had mended as much as it was going to. The claw marks from the bear would never fully fade, and my leg still stiffened every morning like it needed convincing to function. But I was alive, still here, and apparently that alone made me a bit of a frontier celebrity. Historical fact tales of my survival spread like wildfire. In a time before newspapers were common, on the frontier, stories traveled by mouth, passed between trappers, traders, and soldiers over campfires and whiskey. Some said I fought off the bear with my bare hands. Others claimed I was part spirit, part man, and couldn't be killed. I didn't argue. The West had no shortage of stories, and if folks wanted to add a little spice to mine, well, I'd earned it. One day, I stopped by a fur trader's outpost near the Platte River, and a Frenchman there stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are the one who crawled, no?" "The bear man." I nodded. He crossed himself and handed me a drink on the house. I didn't tell him that the real horror wasn't the bear, or even being left behind. It was the silence, the days and nights when I didn't know if I'd ever see another human face again. That kind of loneliness gets under your skin and lives there like a second soul. Around this time, I started traveling with other trapping parties again. Not for the money, though. Oh, that helped, but for the company. I'd spent too long with only shadows for company. Even Baptiste's bizarre ghost stories felt like comfort food now. One trip took me deep into the Yellowstone territory, where we had to cross terrain so treacherous our horses refused to go forward. I remembered dragging myself across similar ground, except back then I'd been bleeding from 10 places and half starved. Perspective is a strange thing. Bizarre fact of the day, somewhere near the Bighorn River, we found a man who'd been living alone for so long he'd forgotten how to talk, just barked like a dog and hoarded pine cones. The mountain does strange things to lonely people. At one point, a young trapper asked me, "Is it true, Mr. Glass, that you killed the bear with a spoon?" I laughed so hard I coughed for 10 minutes. "No," I wheezed. "The bear nearly killed me. I just didn't let it finish the job." Historians still debate how much of my story is fact and how much is folklore. Some say I never crawled the whole way to Fort Kiowa. Others believe Fitzgerald didn't steal anything, that it was all misunderstanding and memory warped by pain. But I know what I lived, and honestly, the truth was wild enough without embroidery. There was a quiet moment that sticks in my memory. I was sitting by a creek, cleaning my knife, and a doe walked right past me. Didn't flinch, didn't bolt, just looked at me like I was part of the scenery. I didn't move. For once, I didn't want to kill something. I just wanted to be. I thought about that bear a lot. Not with hate, oddly. More like respect. She wasn't evil. She was just doing what mothers do, protecting her young. And me, I was the intruder. In her mind, she'd won. Maybe she had. I started carrying a small bear claw around my neck. Found it later on one of my trips, maybe not hers, but close enough. It reminded me what I'd been through, what I'd survived. Sometimes, late at night, I'd touch that claw and wonder if there was any point to all of it. Why had I lived when so many others didn't? Why had I crawled, fought, healed, hunted, for what? And the answer was always the same: because I could. Life on the frontier wasn't gentle. It didn't hand out prizes for endurance. But every now and then, it gave you a sunrise over a silent valley, or a warm fire shared with men who knew how close the dark could get. And in those moments, survival felt like a kind of quiet rebellion. If you've made it this far, you probably think I spent the rest of my life sitting around campfires telling the same bear story to wide-eyed kids while puffing a pipe and occasionally poking the fire for dramatic effect. I didn't. I went back into the wild. Because here's the truth. After you've come face to face with death and survived, everything else feels a little quieter. Not easier, never easier, but less intimidating. Hunger, I'd known worse. Pain, please. I crawled across 200 miles of unforgiving terrain. A twisted ankle or a toothache barely registered anymore. So I did what mountain men do. I trapped. I traded. I guided. And I kept to myself. People started to recognize me. Not in a big celebrity way. This was the 1820s, not Hollywood. But enough that when I walked into a fort or a lodge, folks nudged each other. "That's Glass," they'd whisper. "The one with the grizzly scars." I won't pretend I didn't enjoy the respect. It made things smoother. Got me a better cut of meat now and then, an extra drink, fewer questions. But it also brought something I didn't expect: expectation. People wanted me to be invincible. They figured a man who beat death once could do it again on demand. One night, while traveling near the Yellowstone River, I ended up with a group of younger trappers. They were full of fire and recklessness, the kind of guys who thought the wilderness was a game. One of them asked me, "Glass, you ever scared anymore?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Every time I open my eyes, kid." They laughed like it was a joke. It wasn't. You see, surviving doesn't make you fearless. It makes you careful. I slept lighter, watched the shadows, kept my knife within reach, and always took the high ground when possible. Historical fact. Many mountain men of the era didn't live past their 30s. Disease, accidents, and violence took most of them. If you made it to 40, folks assumed you were part witch or just too stubborn to die. Somewhere around my 40s, I joined up with the party, heading toward the upper Missouri. We were chasing beaver pelts and trying not to cross into territory that'd get us scalped or shot. Pretty standard stuff. That's when we ran into a group of Mandan. And I'll tell you what, they were some of the most dignified, sharp-eyed people I ever met. Traded with clarity, respected strength. One elder looked at the scars on my face and said something to his grandson. The boy nodded, then handed me a carved bone necklace shaped like a claw. I didn't ask for it, didn't understand the words, but I wore it. Now, here's your bizarre fact. Some tribes believe that a man who survives a bear attack gains the spirit of the animal, becoming stronger, more aware, more connected to the land. I don't know if that's true, but I did start having dreams. Vivid ones. In one, I was running on 4 legs through snow, chasing something I couldn't see. I'd wake up breathless and sweating, my hands curled like claws. The mind does strange things. I had a few more close calls. Almost drowned crossing the Powder River. Got snowed in near the Bighorns and survived 5 days on nothing but pine bark and melted snow. Once, a cougar leapt at me while I was gutting a deer. I didn't flinch, just turned, lifted my rifle and dropped it in midair. My hands didn't even shake. "You're not human," one of the trappers whispered afterward. Maybe not entirely. Not anymore. Historians still debate whether I truly wanted to keep living out there or whether I just didn't know how to stop. No family, no home. Just the land, the scars, and the legend chasing behind me like a shadow with teeth. At one point, I tried to settle near Fort Union, built myself a small cabin, chopped wood, tanned hides, and tried to live like a normal man. It lasted 3 weeks. The silence was too loud. I packed up and left one morning before the frost melted. Something kept calling me back to the wild. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the only place that still made sense. Or maybe I was still looking for something, proof that what I'd survived had meant something more than just not dying. I met another man once, older than me, who had lost a leg to frostbite. He carved a wooden peg, kept trapping, kept walking, like he had something left to prove. I asked him why he stayed out here, why he didn't retire somewhere safe. He looked at me and said, "What else is there? Towns are full of people pretending not to be scared. Out here, at least the fear is honest." That stuck with me. I wasn't chasing danger anymore. I just wanted peace. And for me, peace didn't come from comfort. It came from knowing exactly what waited out there and choosing to face it anyway. I didn't expect to grow old. Most mountain men didn't. We lived hard, burned bright, and usually ended up face down in the mud with an arrow in our backs or a knife in our gut. But somehow, I kept waking up, morning after morning, scarred stiff and increasingly grumpy, but still here. By the early 1830s, I was spending more time near forts and rivers, places where the younger trappers passed through. I wasn't trapping as much, more guiding now. More stories around the fire than hunts in the woods. My knees complained too much, and my shoulder never fully healed from the bear. Cold mornings made it grind like old wagon wheels. But the stories, oh, those never aged. They called me Old Glass now, the living legend. The one who'd wrestled death and come out the other side with claw marks and a stare that made younger men stop talking mid-sentence. Some of the kids asked me to show them the scars. I didn't. Not out of modesty. I just didn't want to relive it. Historical fact. By the 1830s, the fur trade was starting to decline. Silk hats were becoming more fashionable than beaver felt, and many trappers were either retiring going broke or moving west in search of new territory. The wild frontier wasn't shrinking, it was changing. I tried to change with it, but truth be told, I was always more grizzly than gentleman. I started hearing rumors that someone was writing about me. A pamphlet, maybe even a book. That my story had become one of the great survival epics told in trading posts and taverns across the country. One French trapper even claimed to have seen a drawing of me, face-twisted bare, on top knife raised, like I was fighting for the soul of America. He handed me a crude sketch. I looked like a madman. "I didn't even have the knife then," I muttered. He shrugged. "They like it better that way." And that's the thing. The more people told my story, the less it belonged to me. It had taken on a life of its own. In some versions, I was dragged by wolves for 5 miles and bit one of them to death. In others, I healed in a cave by eating moss and whispering to the spirits of dead trappers. Bizarre fact. One pamphlet claimed I was part bear. Myself born under a blood moon and raised by wolves. It sold surprisingly well. I didn't mind, mostly. But sometimes, sitting alone by a fire, I wondered if people remembered the truth. Not the knife fights, not the Hollywood endings, but the raw, slow crawl of it all. The months of cold, the taste of insects, the loneliness so thick it pressed on your chest like wet bark. One evening at Fort Cass, a young officer bought me a drink and asked Mr. Glass if you could change one thing, just one, about what happened. Would you? I thought about it. A long time. No, I said eventually, but I wouldn't do it twice. By 1833, I'd settled into a rhythm. Guide a few greenhorns here and there, help with scouting for trading routes, stay away from towns. I tried one more time to settle, built a lean-to near the Yellowstone, caught fish, told myself I was done with danger. Then came the Arikara. They were still out there, still angry, still morning suns lost to earlier skirmishes with trappers and soldiers. Can't say I blamed them. We had carved up their land like it was unclaimed meat. One day out scouting alone, I saw smoke curling above a ridge. Too much for one campfire. I turned back, tried to circle wide, but it was too late. The ambush was fast, efficient, deadly. Historians still debate the exact details of my death. Some say I was shot with arrows. Others say I was scalped, and left in a shallow grave. There's even one account claiming I fought back, killed two, and walked a mile before dropping in silence. All I know is I didn't make it back that time, and honestly, that's okay. I wasn't meant to die in bed with a warm blanket. I was meant to fade into the forest, disappear like smoke between trees, become part of the very land that tried to kill me. Maybe they found the bear claw around my neck. Maybe not. But I like to think someone saw it and realized this was no ordinary man. This was the one who crawled, the one who came back, the one who endured. You'd think a man like me would vanish after death quietly, anonymously, like a footprint washed away by river water. After all, that's how most of us mountain men ended up. A final breath under the stars, and then nothing but wind wolves and whispered stories. But not me. Because it turns out the story of Hugh Glass didn't end when I did. If anything, that's when it really started to take root, spreading across trading posts, saloons, forts, and eventually across the entire country. People love a good ghost story, especially when the ghost has claws on his back and a vengeance in his heart. The first big account of my survival came out in a Philadelphia newspaper years after my death. It painted me as larger than life, a man who stared down a bear, crawled across the wild frontier, and forgave his betrayers with a quiet, noble strength. Pretty generous, if you ask me. Historical fact: one of the earliest published versions of my story appeared in the 1825 edition of the Portfolio, a literary magazine. It romanticized the tale, turned it into high drama. No mention of me eating bugs or arguing with logs. Just grit, heroism, and a touch of frontier magic. After that, the stories multiplied. Some called me a martyr of the wilderness. Others said I was a metaphor, living proof that America could survive anything. They added flourishes, that I stitched my own wounds with bear sinew, that I pulled bullets out with a stick and spat on the fire. One account said I tamed the bear and rode it like a horse back to camp. Here's your bizarre fact. There's actually a bar in Kansas named after me where you can order a drink called the Bear Mall. Comes in a glass with claw marks etched into it. Don't ask what's in it, but I'm told it burns like revenge and regret. I became a kind of American folk hero, the frontier's version of a phoenix rising from blood and bone with a new kind of strength. Even today, my name still gets passed around campfires and classrooms, usually followed by, and then somehow he survived. I guess people need that. A story that says you can face something bigger, meaner, and more brutal than you, and still come out the other side breathing. Still come out angry. Still come out at all. But here's what gets me. They talk about the bear, the crawling, the revenge, but they don't always talk about the silence, the in-between moments, the way I had to lie still for hours feeling bugs crawl over my wounds, knowing help wasn't coming. The way the cold slipped into my bones and stayed there like a whisper that never stopped. Historians still debate how much of my tale is fact and how much is folklore. Some say I exaggerated. Others argue I didn't tell the story at all, that it was built around me by others men who needed a hero and weren't too picky about the details. Truth is, I don't mind. Let them tell it how they want. I know what I lived, and maybe the real legacy isn't in the stories themselves, but in what they mean. That a man can be broken and still keep moving. That nature can tear you apart, but it can't take your will unless you give it permission. That forgiveness, in the end, is a quieter kind of revenge. In the years after my death, other trappers tried to follow the Hugh Glass trail. Some made it halfway. Others turned back. A few died trying. There's a marker out there now, nothing fancy. Just a stone and some words carved into it. Here lies Hugh Glass, survivor. Not hero, not warrior, just survivor. That's enough. I wonder sometimes if Fitzgerald ever told his side of the story. If Bridger lived with the guilt or let it fade like old scars. I wonder if the bear ever came back to that clearing, sniffed the ground and wondered what kind of creature it had tried to kill. And I wonder if people generations from now will still be telling this story. Still picturing that moment, me on the forest floor, blood soaking the earth, body torn open, and somewhere deep inside a spark that said, not yet, not like this. You've stayed with me this long, so here's the part where things soften, where the sharp edges round out, where we stop running and sit quietly for a moment, just you, me, and the sound of a distant river. I'm not a saint. I wasn't the strongest, the smartest, or the fastest, but I was stubborn. And sometimes that's all it takes. When the world claws you down, when the fire in your chest flickers low, what matters isn't whether you rise like a hero. What matters is whether you keep crawling. There are still arguments today about what really happened out there in 1823. Did I really crawl the entire way from the Grand River to Fort Kiowa? Did Bridger actually think I was dead, or was he just scared? Did Fitzgerald know I was alive when he took my gear and ran? We'll never know. Historians still debate whether my crawl was 200 miles or something closer to 80. Whether I was helped by friendly Pawnee or floated much of the way downriver. They dissect the timelines, challenge the locations, scrutinize the names. That's what history does. It tries to order chaos, turn scars into footnotes. But out in the wild, things don't unfold so neatly. You bleed, you crawl, you guess. You listen to the wind and wonder if it's telling you to keep going or to give in. You learn not to ask for mercy, just direction. And eventually, the story becomes bigger than the man. People don't tell the story of Hugh Glass just because it's exciting. They tell it because something deep inside all of us wants to believe we could do the same. That if it came down to it, we'd survive. We'd fight. We'd keep going. But here's the secret. It wasn't strength that got me through. It was hunger for justice, for life, for one more sunrise. I didn't drag myself through snow and thorns because I thought I was legendary. I did it because I refused to let the world have the last word. Here's a strange fact to finish on. Grizzly Grizzly bears have no natural predators. They live on their terms. When I met that bear, I wasn't in a fight. I was in a conversation. One, I wasn't supposed to win, but I did. And I carried the weight of that conversation every day after. Sometimes, I think about the moment I first saw her, those dark eyes, that sudden blur of movement. I remember the sound more than anything. Not the growl, the silence before it, the heartbeat of the forest, the way the air stopped moving. And now, as my story winds down, I want to leave you with this. You don't need to be a mountain man to survive something impossible. You don't need scars to earn your strength. All you need is that quiet, angry ember inside you, the one that says, not yet. The one that burns even when everything else has gone dark. That's what makes you legendary. Not the distance, not the bear, not the revenge. Just the fact that you kept going. So when life pushes you into the dirt, when your legs give out, and the night feels longer than the day, remember the man who crawled. Not for glory, not for gold, just for the chance to stand up again and say, I'm still here. Thank you for listening. And so the story of Hugh Glass comes to an end, not with a roar, but with a whisper. A whisper that's carried through the trees, across the rivers and into the hearts of those who need it most. The kind of story you don't just hear, you feel it. In your bones, in your breath, in the stillness after the storm. I hope this tale reminded you that survival isn't loud. It's not polished. It's messy, painful, and sometimes completely absurd. But it's real. And if a half-dead trapper could crawl through the jaws of nature and come out not just alive, but changed, maybe there's a part of you that can too, because we all have our bears. Maybe yours isn't claws and teeth. Maybe it's loss, grief, doubt, betrayal. Maybe it's waking up one more day when you thought you couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember Hugh Glass when it matters most. Not because he was perfect, but because he refused to quit. So wherever you are, out on a trail, curled up in bed, or riding out your own long winter, remember this: the fire never dies. It just waits until you're ready to rise again. Thanks for staying with me till the end. Take a deep breath, let it out slow, and carry this story with you. And if you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe. I've got more stories to share. Quiet ones, wild ones, true ones. Until next time, rest easy.